December 17th, 1944. Somewhere in the frozen forests of Belgium, Hauptmann Friedrich Weber crouched beside a Panther tank that would never move again. Empty. Bone dry. The fuel gauge had read zero for the past 6 hours. Around him, scattered across the snowy landscape like abandoned toys, sat another dozen German vehicles. Half-tracks, trucks, even 2 Tiger tanks, all silent, all useless, all out of fuel. Weber pressed his gloved hand against the tank's cold steel hull. 48 hours ago, this machine had been the spearhead of Germany's last great offensive in the West. 48 hours ago, his commanders had promised him that American fuel depots lay just beyond the next ridge, ripe for capture. The plan had been simple, almost elegant. German forces would launch a surprise attack through the Ardennes, capture American supply dumps, refuel from enemy stocks, and drive all the way to Antwerp. They had captured one depot, 50,000 gallons at Honsfeld. It had seemed like a fortune at the time. Weber's unit had cheered, had filled every available container. But 50,000 gallons disappeared in hours when you were running Panthers, Tigers, and half-tracks through winter terrain. And then they had reached Stavelot. Weber would never forget Stavelot. His advance guard had been within sight of the massive American fuel depot. 3 million gallons. 3 million. He had seen the storage tanks through his binoculars, vast cylindrical structures that dwarfed anything Germany had maintained even in peacetime. His men had pushed forward, fighting desperately to reach those tanks before the Americans could react. They had been too slow. American engineers had set fires that turned the winter sky orange. Weber had watched through his field glasses as American trucks, hundreds of them, had evacuated the depot in an organized convoy. In 3 days, the Americans had moved nearly 3 million gallons away from the coast, German advance. The remaining 120,000 gallons burned as a roadblock, the smoke visible for miles. But what haunted Weber now, sitting beside his dead Panther in the Belgian snow, was not the fuel they had failed to capture. It was the casual wastefulness of it. The Americans had burned 120,000 gallons, more fuel than Weber's entire division had possessed at the start of the offensive, and they had burned it simply to deny it to the enemy. Not because they needed it, not because it was precious. They burned it because they had so much more where that came from. If you are enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Weber had been a logistics officer before the war, had studied industrial production at university in Berlin. The numbers he had seen in the past 2 days made no sense according to everything he understood about modern warfare. Germany's entire monthly fuel allocation for the Western Front would not have filled half of that one depot at Stavelot, and the Americans had evacuated it, casually, as if losing 3 million gallons was merely an inconvenience. His radioman approached, boots crunching in the snow. "Hauptmann, orders from division. We are to abandon all vehicles and retreat on foot. The offensive has failed. No fuel reserves available." Weber nodded slowly. No fuel reserves. Of course not. Germany had launched this offensive with half the fuel needed, gambling everything on capturing American supplies. It was not strategy. It was desperation dressed up as boldness. He thought about the intelligence briefings before the attack. German command had been so confident. The Americans were soft, they said, overextended. Their supply lines were stretched thin across France. One good push and they would collapse. But nobody had mentioned the depots. Nobody had mentioned that the Americans could simply throw away more fuel in a day than Germany produced in a month. Weber climbed onto the Panther's hull one last time, looking back east toward Germany. Somewhere behind him, less than 100 miles away, German civilians were receiving ration cards for kerosene. Women were cooking on wood stoves because there was no coal. Factories were operating at half capacity or shutting down entirely because there was no fuel to power them. And here he sat, in Belgium, in a tank that Germany could barely afford to build, now useless because there was no fuel to run it. He had joined the Wehrmacht in 1938, had believed in Germany's technological superiority, its organizational efficiency, its modern military machine. In the early years, racing across Poland and France, it had seemed true. German armor, German tactics, German discipline all appeared unstoppable. But that was when the distances were short, when fuel depots were close, when the enemy collapsed before. Germany's reserves ran dry. This was different. The Americans were different. Weber had seen a captured American supply manifest 2 weeks ago, just a routine inventory from a single core depot. The numbers had seemed like a typographical error. 300,000 jerrycans, 50,000 barrels of gasoline, 20,000 barrels of diesel. Thousands of tons of lubricants, antifreeze, spare parts. For one corps, the Americans had apparently more supplies in a single forward depot than Germany maintained in its entire strategic reserve. And they kept replacing it. That was the part Weber could not comprehend. The Americans lost supplies to German attacks, to accidents, to the normal wastage of war, and within days, sometimes hours, the depots were full again. American trucks, endless columns of them, brought supplies forward in a river of logistics that never seemed to diminish. His own supply situation had always been precarious. Even in the supposedly victorious campaigns of early war, German logistics had been improvised, fragile, dependent on captured enemy fuel and ammunition to keep moving. The blitzkrieg tactics that so impressed the world were partly born of necessity. Attack fast, keep moving, because if you stopped, you ran out of everything. Weber had once heard a joke among logistics officers. What is the most important part of the German war machine? The answer, horses. It was not really a joke. The Wehrmacht still used over 1 million horses for transport. Most German infantry divisions marched on foot, their supplies pulled by horse-drawn wagons, like Napoleon's army. Meanwhile, the Americans rolled everywhere in trucks, jeeps, half-tracks, vehicles that required fuel. And the Americans had that fuel. Somehow, impossibly, they had all the fuel they needed, and more. Weber remembered Kasserine Pass in North Africa, Germany's last significant victory against American forces, back in February 1943. German commanders had been stunned by what they captured. Mountains of American supplies, fuel, ammunition, food, equipment, all stacked in such abundance that German soldiers thought it must be a trap. Nobody maintained forward supplies in those quantities unless they knew more was coming. The Germans tried to hide their shock behind bravado, tried to pretend they had expected such bounty, but Weber had seen the reports. German generals were writing to high command, asking how the Americans could possibly sustain such logistical excess. The answer, Weber had eventually understood, was that for Americans, it was not excess. It was normal. The United States produced so much of everything that what seemed like wasteful abundance to German eyes was simply standard procedure to American planners. His thoughts drifted to something he had read in a captured American magazine, found in a foxhole after a skirmish in France. The magazine, some kind of industrial trade publication, had contained an article about American oil production. Weber had read it carefully, checking the numbers multiple times because they seemed impossible. According to the article, the United States was producing over 4.5 million barrels of oil per day. Per day. That was more than Germany produced in a month from all sources, natural and synthetic combined. But even more shocking were the casual details buried in the article. It mentioned in passing that American oil companies had built new pipelines over 1,000 miles long to transport oil from Texas to the East Coast, not because of shortages, but simply to improve efficiency. The article mentioned that these pipelines moved over 300,000 barrels per day, and that was considered one project among many. Weber had shared the article with his fellow officers. They had studied it like an enemy battle plan, trying to find weakness, trying to understand how to fight an enemy with such resources. The conclusion was always the same. You could not. Not in a war of production, not in a war of attrition. Germany could only win if it could knock America out of the fight quickly, decisively, before American industrial power fully mobilized. By December 1944, sitting in the snow beside a dead tank, Weber knew that chance had passed. Had probably passed in 1942, if he was honest. Maybe earlier. Maybe the moment Japan attacked Pearl Harbor and brought America fully into the war, the outcome had been determined. Germany just had not realized it yet. His radio man was distributing chocolate to the crew. German chocolate, not captured supplies for once, the last of their rations. Tomorrow they would march east on foot, abandoning millions of Reichsmarks worth of armored vehicles because there was no fuel to move them. Across the Atlantic, American factories were probably churning out more tanks, more trucks, more jeeps, and American oil fields were pumping the fuel to run them all. Weber fought in Russia, had seen German logistics collapse in the vast distances of the Eastern Front. He had watched German soldiers freeze because there was no fuel to bring winter supplies forward, had seen tanks abandoned in the snow because there was no diesel, had witnessed the slow grinding down of German military power against the twin enemies of distance and scarcity. But Russia was different. Russia was brutal and desperate and chaotic. Everyone suffered from logistics failures in Russia. The Soviets themselves barely kept their forces supplied. What made the American situation so demoralizing was the ease of it. The Americans fought a fully mechanized war, across an ocean, supplying forces in Europe and the Pacific simultaneously, and they did it with such casual abundance that they could burn 120,000 gallons of fuel simply to spite the enemy. That was power. Real power. Not the power of will or ideology or racial theory. The power of production. The power of having so much that waste did not matter. The power of a nation that could supply its forces so thoroughly that losing 3 million gallons of fuel was merely an operational setback, quickly corrected. 2 years ago, Weber had believed Germany would win because Germans were disciplined, organized, technologically superior. Now he understood that discipline could not overcome scarcity, that organization could not create fuel from nothing, that technology without resources was just expensive metal. The Americans had proven that material superiority could overwhelm tactical excellence, that having enough was better than being better. December 17th, 1944. The Battle of the Bulge was failing not because of American courage, though they fought well, and not because of German mistakes, though there had been many. It was failing because German tanks were running out of fuel, while American depots held millions of gallons, and that simple arithmetic made every other factor irrelevant. Weber had studied warfare at university. He had read Clausewitz and Moltke and all the German military theorists. They had taught him about maneuver, about initiative, about seizing key terrain and breaking enemy will. None of them had prepared him for this. For the hollow feeling of commanding first-rate equipment, leading well-trained men, executing tactically sound operations, and losing anyway because the enemy had more fuel in one depot than your entire nation could produce. The light was fading. His men were setting up camp beside the abandoned vehicles, trying to stay warm with small fires that would give away their position but provided the only heat available. Tomorrow they would begin the long march back to Germany, where fuel shortages meant factories running at half capacity, where synthetic fuel plants that had taken years to build were being systematically destroyed by American bombers, where the mighty German war machine was grinding to a halt, not from battle damage, but from simple starvation of resources. Hauptmann Weber had expected to drive his Panther to Antwerp, to refuel from captured American stocks, to help cut off Allied armies and force a negotiated peace. Instead, he sat beside a silent tank in the snow, contemplating the simple fact that Germany had lost not when its armies were defeated, but much earlier, when it had started a war against an enemy that could produce fuel faster than Germany could use it. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. 4 months earlier, August 1944. Fritz Müller stood in what remained of the Leuna synthetic fuel plant, Germany's largest, staring at twisted metal and rubble where complex chemical equipment had stood just days before. The American bombers had come again, the third major raid in a month. Müller was a chemical engineer, had helped design these facilities, had spent years perfecting the hydrogenation process that turned German coal into liquid fuel. The Americans were destroying his life's work, methodically, scientifically, with precision bombing that seemed to target exactly the most critical components. Müller walked through the wreckage, cataloguing the damage. The electrical grid was destroyed. The gas and water mains were ruptured. The complex distillation towers that separated synthetic gasoline from heavier petroleum products lay twisted like fallen trees. This plant, at its peak earlier in the year, had produced over 38,000 tons of gasoline and diesel per month. Now it produced nothing, and Leuna was not alone. Politz, destroyed. Bohlen, heavily damaged. Zeitz, burning. The Americans had identified Germany's synthetic fuel infrastructure as a strategic target and were systematically erasing it from existence. Müller had warned his superiors years ago. Germany lacked natural petroleum reserves. The Ploiești oil fields in Romania provided some relief, but they were vulnerable to bombing and could not meet German needs. The synthetic fuel program, converting coal to liquid fuel through chemical processes, was Germany's lifeblood. But it required enormous facilities, complex equipment, specialized personnel, and above all, continuous operation. Stop production for repairs, and it took weeks or months to return to full capacity. The Americans understood this. Their bombers did not just drop explosives randomly. They studied German industrial processes, identified bottlenecks, targeted electrical transformers and cooling systems, and purification equipment. The kind of precision that required intelligence, reconnaissance, photography, detailed industrial knowledge. Müller had once believed German synthetic fuel production was an engineering marvel. At its peak in early 1944, Germany's 25 synthetic fuel plants produced over 124,000 barrels of gasoline and diesel per day from coal. It had seemed like a triumph of German technical ingenuity. Take Germany's abundant coal reserves, apply chemical processes developed by brilliant German scientists, and produce the liquid fuel the war machine required. Now, walking through the ruins of Leuna, Müller understood that German ingenuity had built a system that was powerful but fragile, sophisticated but vulnerable. The entire synthetic fuel infrastructure depended on massive industrial facilities that could not be hidden, could not be moved, and once destroyed, took enormous resources and time to rebuild. Meanwhile, America pumped oil directly from the ground. Natural petroleum, abundant in Texas and Oklahoma and California, no complex hydrogenation process required. No enormous chemical plants vulnerable to bombing. Just drill a well, extract the oil, refine it in conventional refineries, and ship it where needed. Simple, resilient, scalable. Müller had seen the intelligence estimates. Before the war, the United States produced roughly 63% of the world's oil. 63%. From natural wells. While Germany struggled to synthesize even a fraction of its needs from coal through complex and energy-intensive industrial processes, America simply extracted oil that nature had already created and stored underground for millions of years. A colleague approached, covered in ash and soot. Müller recognized him as Johann, another senior engineer. "How long to repair?" Müller asked. Johann shook his head. 3 months minimum. Maybe longer. We need electrical transformers that no longer exist in Germany. We need replacement catalysts. We need skilled workers who are now in the Wehrmacht. And the Americans will bomb us again before we finish. It was true. The pattern had become predictable. German crews would repair damage, restart production, and within weeks, American bombers would return. Each raid set production back, further. The cumulative effect was devastating. At the peak in April, Johann said quietly, we produced 315,000 tons of gasoline. Now we might manage 5,000 tons in a good month. If we are lucky. Müller knew the mathematics. Germany's military consumed roughly 200,000 tons of fuel per month just to maintain basic operations. Offensive operations required much more. With domestic synthetic production collapsing and Romanian sources uncertain, Germany was burning through strategic reserves with no way to replace them. He thought about the Americans, about their seemingly endless fuel supplies, about how American bomber formations required tremendous quantities of high-octane aviation fuel just to execute the raids that destroyed German fuel production. The Americans were using fuel to destroy Germany's ability to produce fuel. It was economic warfare at its purest. But what haunted Müller was not just the quantity of American fuel production. It was the efficiency. American oil came from the ground, requiring minimal processing compared to German synthetic fuel. An American oil well could be drilled in weeks. A German synthetic fuel plant required years to design and build, millions of Reichsmarks in investment, and thousands of skilled workers to operate. The Americans were fighting an industrial war with industrial advantages, so overwhelming that German technical skill could not compensate. Müller had designed beautiful, sophisticated chemical processes. American petroleum engineers just drilled holes in the ground and let physics do the work. He remembered a conversation from 1941, before the war expanded to its current dimensions. A colleague had returned from a technical conference in Switzerland with American petroleum industry journals. They had studied them in detail, trying to understand American capabilities. One article discussed something called the Big Inch Pipeline. Americans had built a 24-inch diameter pipeline over 1,200 miles long from Texas to the East Coast. The article explained this was necessary because German U-boats were sinking tankers along the Atlantic coast, so American petroleum planners simply built a massive overland pipeline to move oil inland where submarines could not reach it. The project had taken just over a year. 1 year to build 1,200 miles of pipeline carrying hundreds of thousands of barrels of oil per day. The article mentioned it casually, as if building transcontinental pipelines was routine. Müller and his colleagues had been stunned. Germany had no comparable pipeline infrastructure. German oil was moved by rail, by barge, by truck, all vulnerable to interdiction, all inefficient compared to pipelines. And the Americans built these pipelines not as desperate wartime measures, but simply as logistical improvements. That was when Müller first understood the scale of American industrial capacity. It was not just larger than Germany's, it was different in kind. Americans thought bigger, built bigger, produced more, and did it with a casualness that suggested they were not even fully exerting themselves. Johann interrupted his thoughts. The Politz plant is completely destroyed. They estimate it will never produce again before the war ends. Brabag plants are operating at 10% capacity. The entire synthetic fuel program is collapsing. Müller nodded slowly. He had known it was coming. The mathematics were irrefutable. Germany had launched a war requiring mobile, mechanized forces. Those forces consumed fuel. But Germany lacked domestic petroleum, and the synthetic fuel facilities that could have provided an alternative were now systematically being destroyed faster than they could be repaired. What happens when we run out? Johann asked. Not low on fuel. Completely out. No reserves. Nothing. Müller did not answer. He knew what happened. German tanks would sit motionless. German trucks would be abandoned. The Luftwaffe would be grounded. German forces, no matter how well trained or well equipped, would be immobilized. War required movement, and movement required fuel, and fuel was something Germany no longer had. He thought about the Wehrmacht's reliance on horses. Over 1 million horses still pulled German supply wagons, artillery pieces, and equipment. German propaganda showed modern tanks and aircraft, projecting an image of mechanized superiority. But the reality was that most German logistics still depended on animals, on 19th-century transportation methods, while the Americans rolled across France in endless columns of trucks. And those American trucks ran on gasoline and diesel that flowed in quantities Müller could barely comprehend. The United States supplied not just its own military but provided fuel to the British, to the Soviets, to Free French forces, to every Allied nation. 6 billion barrels of oil over the course of the war. American oil, from American wells, refined in American facilities, shipped in American tankers, or moved through American pipelines. 6 billion barrels. Müller converted the number in his head. That was roughly 252 billion gallons. Over the entire war, roughly 42 billion gallons per year. Per year, America provided enough oil to run the entire Allied war effort. Germany's total synthetic fuel production at peak capacity had been perhaps 30 million barrels per year. The Americans produced more oil in 10 days than Germany synthesized in a year. And that American oil came from wells that could not be bombed from Europe, from facilities spread across a continent protected by oceans, from an industrial base so vast that destroying any single component barely mattered. That was the real inequality, not German versus American fighting spirit, not tactical doctrine, not even technological sophistication. The inequality was in resources, in geography, in the fundamental economic capacity to sustain modern warfare. Germany had tried to compensate through synthetic fuel programs, through captured resources, through brilliant engineering. But compensation had limits. Eventually, the side with more simply won. Müller looked at the ruins of Leuna. Somewhere in Texas, American oil rigs pumped crude from the ground. Somewhere in Louisiana, American refineries processed that crude into gasoline and diesel. Somewhere in the Atlantic, American tankers carried it overseas. And somewhere in France, American trucks distributed it to depots measured in millions of gallons. The Americans had not just won the war, they had made winning inevitable through sheer material abundance. Germany could not bomb American oil wells, could not interdict American production, could only watch as American fuel flowed endlessly forward while German fuel dried up. "We should leave," Johann said. "Soviets will be in Luna soon anyway." "This plant is finished," Müller nodded. The plant was finished. The synthetic fuel program was finished. Germany's hope of fueling a mechanized war was finished. All that remained was to watch the inevitable conclusion play out. June 1943. Wilhelm Braun, a corporal in the Afrika Korps, stood in an American prisoner of war camp in Mississippi, staring at supplies stacked in quantities that made no sense. He had been captured 2 months earlier in Tunisia, had crossed the Atlantic in the hold of a Liberty ship with 3,000 other German prisoners, and had arrived in America expecting, well, he was not sure what he had expected. Propaganda had told him Americans were brutal, that prisoners faced harsh treatment. The reality was so different from propaganda that Braun struggled to process it. The camp itself was clean, organized, almost comfortable. Barracks with real beds, latrines that worked, medical facilities staffed by competent doctors. Food, not gourmet but adequate and regular. But what stunned Braun was not the camp conditions, it was everything beyond the wire. The guards drove jeeps and trucks as if fuel were limitless. Americans seemed to use vehicles for everything, even short trips. In the Afrika Korps, fuel had been rationed so strictly that soldiers walked miles rather than waste precious gasoline on transport. Here, American guards thought nothing of driving across camp for routine errands. Braun watched American supply trucks arrive daily, always full, always on schedule. Food, medicine, equipment, mail, everything arrived in abundance. The trucks themselves were standardized, mass-produced, thousands identical to each other. In the Afrika Korps, the motor pool had been a collection of captured British vehicles, Italian trucks, German half-tracks, and civilian vehicles pressed into service. Maintenance had been a nightmare. The Americans simply produced one standard design and built thousands of them. One day, an American sergeant, assigned as a translator because his grandmother was German, engaged Braun in conversation. The sergeant seemed curious about the Afrika Korps, asked questions about tactics and desert warfare. Eventually, the conversation turned to supplies. "How much fuel did your tanks carry?" the sergeant asked. Braun explained that a Panzer IV carried roughly 120 gallons, enough for roughly 80 miles of range in ideal conditions. Less in desert sand and combat conditions. "We spent more time scrounging for fuel than fighting," Braun admitted. "Half our victories meant capturing British petrol before it was destroyed." The sergeant nodded. "Yeah, we heard about that. Your logistics were pretty rough. Must have been hard." Hard was an understatement. Braun remembered days when German tanks sat motionless because there was no fuel. He remembered watching British supply convoys in the distance, knowing they contained the fuel and ammunition his unit desperately needed but could not reach. He remembered the constant anxiety about fuel levels, the careful rationing, the desperate calculations of whether they had enough diesel to both attack and withdraw. "How much fuel did American forces have?" Braun asked. The sergeant shrugged. "Honestly, we never ran out, not once. Convoys came regular, depots were always full. I never heard of an American unit stuck because of no fuel. Sometimes ammunition got tight, sometimes specific spare parts were hard to get, but fuel? Never a problem." Braun struggled to comprehend this. Never a problem? In the Africa Corps, fuel was always the problem. Every operational plan revolved around fuel availability. Attack here because captured depots there. Retreat because no fuel for continued operations. Stop offensive because fuel trucks did not arrive. The entire North African campaign, from the German perspective, was an endless struggle for fuel. "Where does it all come from?" Braun asked. "Texas mostly," the sergeant replied. "Oklahoma, California, Louisiana. We got oil fields all over. More oil than we know what to do with, honestly." More oil than they knew what to do with. Braun had never heard anyone describe petroleum that way. In Germany, oil was precious, strategic, carefully allocated by high command. Every litre mattered. The Americans had so much they did not even know the total amount. The sergeant continued. "My brother works in the oil fields back home. Says they are pumping day and night, can barely keep up with demand. But they are managing. Government built these huge pipelines to move it all. Thousands of tankers. Whole industry dedicated just to getting oil where it needs to go." Braun thought about the supply situation in North Africa. Rommel's forces had depended on tankers crossing the Mediterranean, vulnerable to British aircraft and submarines. Half the fuel shipped from Italy never reached Africa. The logistics were so fragile that winning battles meant nothing if supplies could not follow. Meanwhile, America moved oil across an entire continent, across oceans, to theaters in Europe and the Pacific simultaneously. The scale was incomprehensible. Over the following weeks, Braun observed American logistics, with the attention of a soldier who had suffered from bad logistics. Every detail revealed more about American industrial capacity. The camp canteen sold Coca-Cola, chocolate, cigarettes, items that were luxuries in wartime Germany, but apparently common here. German prisoners received wages for work, could purchase these items freely. One afternoon, Braun was assigned to a work detail at a nearby railroad depot, loading and unloading freight under guard. He watched American supply trains, dozens of cars long, passing every hour. Each train carried military supplies, food, ammunition, equipment, replacement parts, medical supplies, fuel. The fuel cars fascinated him. Tank cars, each holding thousands of gallons, passing in steady succession. Braun counted once, tried to calculate the volume. In one afternoon, he estimated dozens of tank cars passed, carrying perhaps 500,000 gallons of fuel. Just on this one rail line, just in one afternoon. An American guard noticed his attention. "Impressive, right? This line feeds the depot that supplies the camps and bases in this region. Runs 24 hours. Never stops. Never stops." That was the difference, Braun realized. American logistics never stopped. Supply was continuous, abundant, reliable. German logistics had always been sporadic, inadequate, jury-rigged from whatever was available. "How does your country make so much fuel?" Braun asked. The guard seemed puzzled by the question, as if it was obvious. "We drill for it. Got oil fields in Texas bigger than some European countries, fields in Oklahoma, California, Wyoming. We got oil everywhere. Just gotta get it out of the ground and refine it. Just drill for it." As if it were simple. As if petroleum reserves were unlimited. Braun knew Germany had almost no domestic oil. What little existed at Niigata was minimal. Everything else came from Romania or was synthesized from coal at enormous expense and effort. That evening, back at the camp, Brown shared observations with other prisoners. Several had noticed similar things. Americans used fuel without apparent concern for conservation. Guards left truck engines running while they performed tasks. American logistics seemed built on the assumption that there would always be more fuel, more supplies, more of everything. One prisoner, a former logistics officer named Klaus, summarized it bitterly. "We lost the war the moment we chose enemies. We picked fights with nations that had more resources than we could imagine. The Americans can outproduce us 10 to 1, 20 to 1 in some areas. Soviet Union has manpower and territory we can never match. Britain has the Commonwealth. What did Germany have? Technical skill and will? That is not enough. Not nearly enough." Braun had to agree. He had believed German military superiority would prevail. German training, German tactics, German equipment, and German forces were excellent, but excellence without resources was a losing proposition. The Americans did not need to be as tactically skilled if they had 3 times the tanks, 4 times the fuel, overwhelming air support, and supply lines that never broke. Material abundance was its own form of warfare. The Americans had simply buried German forces under a mountain of production. Every tank Germany destroyed was replaced by 3 American tanks. Every aircraft shot down was replaced by 5 American aircraft. And all those tanks and aircraft ran on fuel that America seemed to produce effortlessly from vast underground reserves that Germany could never access. Braun remembered the propaganda back home. Germany would triumph through superior will, through National Socialist ideology, through racial superiority. But will could not create petroleum. Ideology could not synthesize gasoline from nothing. And war, modern mechanized war, ran on fuel. The side with more fuel, more industrial capacity, more resources, would grind down the side with less. Time and mathematics made the outcome inevitable. Sitting in a Mississippi prisoner of war camp, thousands of miles from any battlefield, Braun saw the war's outcome clearly. American abundance was everywhere. In the supplies that never ran short, in the vehicles that ran constantly, in the casual waste of resources that would have been carefully hoarded in Germany. This was a nation that could wage war almost effortlessly, that had so much industrial capacity that supporting a global war was merely an inconvenience rather than an existential strain. The American sergeant found Braun later that week. "We got newspapers if you can read English, or I can translate if you want, war news." Braun accepted a newspaper. The headlines discussed the Allied invasion of Sicily, advances in the Pacific, industrial production figures. One article caught his attention. It detailed American petroleum production for the year. The numbers seemed impossible. Over 4.5 million barrels per day. That was nearly 1.5 billion barrels per year. Braun did the calculation. At 42 gallons per barrel, America produced roughly 60 billion gallons of oil annually. For comparison, Germany's synthetic fuel production, at peak capacity before the bombing raids, might produce 3 billion gallons per year at enormous cost and effort. America produced 20 times more fuel than Germany, and American fuel came from wells that could not be bombed, could not be destroyed by enemy action, and required minimal processing compared to German synthetic processes. "Something wrong?" the sergeant asked. Braun looked up. "We never had a chance, did we? Germany, I mean." Against this, he gestured at the newspaper, at the supply trucks visible beyond the wire, at everything American abundance represented. The sergeant paused. "Not sure I should answer that. You are still technically the enemy, but between us? No. You never had a chance once America entered the war. Not with our production capacity. My dad worked in an automobile factory before the war. Now it is making tanks and jeeps, every factory like that converted. And we can do that because we got the steel, the rubber, the fuel, all the resources we need. We can just keep building and supplying until we win. Not heroic, maybe, but effective. Not heroic, but effective. That summarized American warfare. German propaganda emphasized heroism, individual courage, tactical brilliance. American warfare emphasized production, logistics, overwhelming material superiority, and in the contest between heroism and production, production was winning. Braun spent the remainder of the war in Mississippi, working farm labor, detail during harvest season, playing football with other prisoners, attending English classes the Americans organized. He gained weight, gained health, and lost any remaining illusion about German victory. The other prisoners shared his conclusions. Germany was losing not because German soldiers were inferior, but because Germany lacked resources to sustain modern warfare against enemies with overwhelming industrial advantages. Will and discipline and tactical skill could achieve temporary victories, could prolong the fight, but could not overcome the simple arithmetic of American oil production. When news came of D-Day, of the Allied landing at Normandy, Braun felt relief more than despair. The sooner it ended, the sooner he could go home. Victory was impossible. Prolonging the war only meant more death for no purpose. A fellow prisoner argued one evening that Germany could still win if they developed wonder weapons, if they held on long enough. Braun shook his head. Wonder. Weapons need fuel to deliver them. V-2 rockets need fuel to produce them. Jets need fuel to fly them. And we have no fuel. The Americans have bombed our synthetic fuel plants to rubble, and we never had natural oil to begin with. It is over. It was over. The mathematics said so. 6 billion barrels of American oil versus Germany's minuscule synthetic production. Endless American convoys versus German forces counting every litre. American fuel depots, measured in millions of gallons, versus German strategic reserves measured in weeks of supply. Germany had gambled that tactical brilliance and early victories would knock enemies out of the war before resources mattered. The gamble failed. And once the war became a contest of production and logistics, once it became about which side could fuel more tanks and supply more armies and sustain operations longer, Germany was outmatched from the start. Braun remembered his last combat action, a skirmish near Tunis. His unit had engaged. British forces had been winning tactically, had pushed them back. Then they received orders to disengage and retreat, not because they were losing the fight, because they were out of fuel. The tanks had barely enough diesel to withdraw, the trucks were running on fumes, ammunition was low. Supplies had not arrived from Sicily because Allied aircraft and submarines had sunk the convoy. They retreated not from British strength but from German weakness, and that weakness was ultimately about resources, about fuel that Germany could not produce in sufficient quantities, about supply lines Germany could not protect, about industrial capacity Germany could not match against enemies with vast resource advantages. The Americans did not defeat Germany through military genius. They defeated Germany by producing more of everything than Germany could keep up with. And the foundation of that production was petroleum, American petroleum, drawn from the ground in quantities that made German. Synthetic fuel efforts seem quaint by comparison. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.